Before we get into specifics here, we have to address the fact that everything I say in this video could end up being worthless, because a lot of the expectations we have for both Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic are based on fights that happened years ago, and a lot has changed since then. Jon Jones made his heavyweight debut against Ciryl Gane about 2 years ago, and he looked pretty good. But that fight lasted about 2 minutes because Ciryl Gane just did not show up to fight that day. And in my opinion, there's still a lot to be seen before we can really determine if the Jon Jones that was so dominant at light heavyweight is going to carry over into the heavyweight division, because we just still haven't seen very much of him at heavyweight. And even since the Gane fight, there's been almost 2 years of inactivity. Jon Jones is now 37 years old. He's also coming off of a shoulder injury. And as far as I know, he's a lot lighter now than he was when he fought Ciryl Gane. I heard somewhere that he's somewhere around in the 230s, something like that, in terms of weight, which is bordering on light heavyweight. That could be possibly because of that injury, or it just could be that Jon Jones is coming in a little bit lighter this time. Who knows? And then you have Stipe, who is coming off of a knockout loss to Francis Ngannou, which happened almost 4 years ago. And now Stipe is 42 years old. The point is, we're basing our predictions for this fight on who Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic were 4 years ago, when they were much younger. Now they're at the tail end of their careers. This was before injury in Jon Jones's case, and a lot has changed since then. So take everything I say in this video with a bit of a grain of salt. So let's start with Jon Jones. Jon Jones is very well-rounded, very experienced. I can't think of any other fighter on the UFC roster who has more championship experience than Jon Jones. He is a phenomenal wrestler. I know he's been training with Gable Steveson and Gordon Ryan leading up to this fight. So even at this point in his career, many people would argue he's the greatest of all time, myself included. He's still seeking people who are experts in their area of mixed martial arts and learning from them. But I'd say Jon Jones's greatest weapon in this fight is the sheer variety of attacks that he uses. Jon Jones has a very multi-layered game, and what it does is it conditions his opponents to expect a lot of different possibilities anytime he's launching an attack. A really good example of this is his spinning elbow. And the key is making his opponents think that he is shooting for a single leg. And the fact that Jon Jones is such a great wrestler really makes their opponents take the threat of that single leg seriously, and it makes that spinning elbow so much more effective. See how he lowers into his stance? It really looks like he's looking to grab that lead leg of Gustafsson's, but then he transitions it into the spinning elbow. Another really great example of Jon Jones's layered game is his kicks. He always throws a variety of kicks. I think it's what helps set up his head kicks so well and why he's really good at landing head kicks. He throws oblique kicks, he throws front kicks, he throws body kicks, he throws inside leg kicks, outside leg kicks, and all of these things sort of soften up his opponents a little bit to expect all of these possibilities whenever he's throwing a kick, which is why the perfect example of this was his fight with Daniel Cormier, because throughout the first few rounds of that fight, he was throwing a lot of front kicks and a lot of body kicks. So in that finishing sequence, it's really, really obvious that DC was expecting a kick to the body, and of course, went up top and he got the knockout. He also did this really well against Alexander Gustafsson. There were a lot of times in that fight where Gustafsson starts to hunch over and lean into the head kick because he was expecting a kick to the body. And a few times it actually landed pretty clean, or he defended it at the very last second. It's sort of difficult to pinpoint what Jon Jones's greatest weakness is because he's such a well-rounded fighter. And in this fight, a lot of people might say his size is his greatest weakness, because he spent most of his career at light heavyweight, now he's moving up to heavyweight, and so where at light heavyweight he used to have somewhat of a height and reach advantage, that might not be the case in a lot of his fights if he continues to fight at heavyweight. But the thing is that Stipe has always kind of been on the smaller side of heavyweights. I think he weighed somewhere in the 230s when he fought Francis Ngannou in their second fight, and so that's kind of right around the same ballpark of where Jon Jones is at weight-wise, and Jones actually still has a reach advantage against Stipe in this fight, which is crazy. It just goes to show how insane it was having an 84-inch reach at light heavyweight. What I have noticed to be somewhat of a problem for Jones in a lot of the fights that he's really struggled in is his speed. One of the things that Reyes and Gustafsson and Machida all did really well was taking advantage of their speed advantage with blitzes. The other thing they did really well was countering off of low kicks, because as we know, Jones throws a lot of kicks, and so a lot of times when he would plan off that lead foot and throw the kick, they would counter with a cross. And it's a really good time to throw a counter because he has all of his weight on one foot, so he's not very mobile. I think Stipe is more likely to counter off a low kick versus taking advantage of blitzing or anything like that. I don't even know if Stipe really has a speed advantage over Jones. That's one of those things that there's really no way of knowing at this point in both of their careers, because they're both much older and we don't really know where their athleticism is at this point. But I do see as a possibility that he could land a nice counterattack as Jon Jones is throwing one of those low kicks. Now let's talk about Stipe. Stipe is very experienced. He is a cardio machine, very tough. He's not a very flashy fighter, but he does the basics very well. He's got a really crisp 1-2. He times his takedowns very well. When he fought Francis Ngannou the first time, Ngannou was much bigger, much stronger, much more powerful, and it was pretty obvious that he had relied on that power and size advantage to sort of bully a lot of his previous opponents, because he came out in the first round with really no respect for Stipe at all. He was throwing huge looping shots and just sort of running him down, and Stipe weathered the storm in the first round, and when he came out in the second round, he was landing a lot more effectively than Francis was, because while Francis was throwing these huge looping shots, Stipe just stuck to the basics. He threw his 1-2, crisp, short, straight punches down the middle, and he caught Francis several times. These are general qualities that I think will serve him well in this fight with Jon Jones, but there's something more specific that he does that I think will help him more specifically in this fight against Jon Jones and his style. Jones tends to be kind of reachy, especially on defense. When his opponents are backing him up, he tends to extend his lead hand out in front of him and sort of cover his head with his backhand. DC also tends to be a little bit reachy. In DC's second fight with Stipe, DC a lot of times would reach out in front of him to try and control Stipe's hands, look to land elbows or wrestle, and he was having a lot of success in the first few rounds with that. But in the fourth round, Stipe made a little adjustment that changed everything. He started going to the body because he realized that if DC was reaching out to try and control his hands, he was leaving an opening in the midsection. And he hit the body shot over and over and over again in the fourth round, and DC had no answers for it. And eventually, it created openings up top, and that's where he got the finish. It's a testament to Stipe's experience and fight IQ, just his ability to recognize openings, recognize things that are not going well for him, and to make little adjustments that ultimately change the tide of the fight entirely. I could see this opening also existing when he fights Jon Jones, because as I said, especially defensively, Jones tends to kind of extend his hands out in front of him. I mean, I know that's why he has a reputation for poking eyes a lot as well, because that's why that happens. He reaches out in front of him and sort of tries to almost like stiff arm his opponents and sort of create a lot of space between them. But I think that could create openings to the body where Stipe could land some good shots. The easy cop-out answer for Stipe's greatest weakness in this fight is just his age and inactivity, because even though Jones has also been a little bit inactive, I think Stipe probably most would argue that the inactivity aspect of this is more a problem for Stipe. And while I do think that is probably his greatest weakness in this fight, that doesn't really say what's actually going to happen in the fight necessarily. It's more of a general thing that's going to affect all aspects of his game. So for now, we're just going to kind of put that aside and talk about something more specific that's actually going to affect the way the fight looks more specifically. I've heard a few people say that Stipe should take advantage of the clinch in this fight, because there's a general notion that Stipe is the bigger heavyweight while Jones is coming up from light heavyweight. And so using the clinch is a way for him to sort of exert his weight and the pressure on Jones and to make him feel the physical difference that Jones has coming up from light heavyweight into the heavyweight division. And honestly, I'm not totally sold that that's the smartest thing for Stipe to do. As we already talked about, there actually isn't really much of a size difference between Jones and Stipe, even though Stipe is more of a natural heavyweight than Jones is. So in that way, I think that making a game plan based on you being larger when you actually aren't just isn't really wise. The other thing is, I think Jones has more tools to use in the clinch than Stipe does. Jones has great elbows, he throws spinning elbows, and the other thing is, in the clinch, I think Jones has an easier access to the body lock, which is sort of his bread and butter when it comes to takedowns. A prime example of the clinch being problematic for Stipe was his first fight with DC. When DC got the underhook with his left arm, Stipe tried to control DC's other wrist because he was probably expecting DC to look for a body lock or try and land shots. And all DC had to do was just swim his arm over the top, and that's where he landed that huge right hand. And Jon Jones definitely has the ability to land a shot like that, and I would argue Jones is even more versatile with his attacks in the clinch than someone like DC is. I think Stipe is much better off when he's just controlling the center, working his simple combinations, backing his opponents up, and just putting on the pressure in that way. So how do I think this fight will play out? As I said at the beginning, it's really hard to say because I think a lot of what this is going to come down to is their general competitive spirit, their aggression, their athleticism, and their toughness at this stage in their career with the amount of inactivity they've had and at their age right now. We can talk about all this game plan stuff and all this strategy and all the skills they've shown throughout their career, but none of that will matter if they're just a shell of themselves. This is very likely a retirement fight for Stipe and possibly even a retirement fight for Jones. But I think this fight is more a test for Jon Jones than it is for Stipe, because we all know Stipe is more or less at the end of his career, and Jon Jones is definitely on his way out as well. But I think there's still a bit of a question as to whether Jon Jones has more of a future in the heavyweight division. Obviously, a lot of people want to see him fight Tom Aspinall. There's talks about him fighting Alex Pereira, and I think how well he does in this fight will kind of determine whether or not he's going to struggle in those fights or be competitive. But I will say, my gut kind of tells me that Jones is the fresher fighter who's closer to his prime than Stipe is, because even though we haven't seen much of him at heavyweight, he did look really good when he fought Ciryl Gane, even though I don't think Stipe is going to be quite as shell-shocked as Ciryl Gane was. I think Jones tends to do really well as the fights carry on. Jones struggled quite a bit in the first few rounds against Alexander Gustafsson and Dominic Reyes, but as the fight went on, he started to take the lead and ultimately got the win. So I think if this fight goes to decision, it seems unlikely that Jones will lose. So really Stipe's best chance of winning this fight is with a finish. Jones is a very good grappler, so I think it's unlikely that Stipe gets a submission. So really, in my opinion, his best path to victory is through a knockout or a TKO, which is possible, but in my opinion, it's kind of unlikely. I think Jones has way more paths to victory. He's a great wrestler. He has great submission game as well, and I think he has a good chance of winning by decision, and I even see him landing some kind of knockout or TKO on the feet with the amount of variety of attacks he throws. I think he can throw lots of different types of kicks to set up a head kick. I think he has good options in the clinch. I think in general, Stipe needs to avoid hanging out in the clinch, control the center to the best of his ability, and stick to what he does best. His crisp 1-2 and his ability to make adjustments in the fight that could help him find openings into Jon Jones's game. I think Jones needs to be cautious about counterattacks when he's throwing his kicks, especially his low kicks, and just to keep giving lots of looks to get Stipe thinking about all these possibilities when he's on the feet, and ultimately look for those knockout shots. Look for that head kick after you've softened him up with body kicks and front kicks. Look for that spinning elbow when you've got Stipe thinking about the single leg or the body lock. Honestly, I wish Tom Aspinall was fighting this weekend, but I still think this fight will be interesting. I think I'm glad that they're finally making this fight happen. I know Jones has been wanting it for a long time, but hopefully we can finally put this fight and this whole issue to rest and get the heavyweight division moving forward again. I think a lot of the future of the division is going to depend on how well Jon Jones does, because if Stipe is a shell of himself and Jon Jones is struggling in this fight, it is not going to look good for him when he's up against Tom Aspinall or even Alex Pereira for that matter. But if he looks great, has a very dominant win, I think everybody would love to see a unification fight between Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall. I think that fight would do crazy numbers with all of the ducking that everyone is saying that Jon Jones is doing, and how everyone just really wants to see Tom Aspinall squash him. I think if Jon Jones looks really good against Stipe and they have that unification fight down the road, I think that would do crazy numbers. But anyways, enjoy the fights on Saturday. Thanks for watching.